Silence is not the absence of emotion, and it is never random. When she goes quiet, it doesn't mean her feelings disappeared. It means they became too loud inside her. Silence is often what happens when the heart feels more than the mind can explain. People assume that if someone stops talking, they've moved on. But real emotional detachment doesn't sound like silence. It sounds like indifference. Silence, on the other hand, is full of meaning. It's loaded with thoughts, memories, and internal conversations that never reach the surface. When emotions are unresolved, words become dangerous. Speaking might expose vulnerability. It might reopen wounds she's trying to protect. So instead of saying the wrong thing, instead of admitting she still cares, she chooses silence. Not because she's empty, but because she's overwhelmed. Silence becomes a form of control, a way to slow down emotions that feel like they might spill out if she speaks even once. Think about this. When someone truly doesn't care, they don't need distance. They don't need space. They don't need silence. They move freely. They speak without hesitation. They don't calculate responses or rehearse conversations in their head. Silence only appears when there is something to lose, when there's an emotional risk involved, when the connection still has weight. Her silence is a strategy, even if she doesn't consciously realize it. It's her way of managing feelings she hasn't figured out yet. She might be replaying moments you shared. She might be wondering if you've changed, if you've moved on, if you still think about her the way she thinks about you. But reaching out would mean exposing herself. It would mean admitting that you still matter. And that admission feels heavier than staying quiet. Silence also gives the illusion of strength. It makes her feel like she's holding the upper hand, even while her mind is full of unanswered questions. On the outside, she appears calm, detached, unbothered. On the inside, there's a conversation happening that never stops. Silence becomes the mask that hides emotional conflict. And here's the truth most people miss: silence is rarely peace. Peace doesn't need effort. Peace doesn't require restraint. Silence requires discipline. It requires her to stop herself from typing, from calling, from asking questions she's afraid of the answers to. That restraint only exists when emotions are still alive. If she truly forgot you, silence wouldn't be necessary. Forgetting doesn't require control. But silence does. It's chosen, it's maintained, it's protected. And that alone tells you that you're not gone from her mind. Silence is also a way of testing. She's watching. Watching to see if you'll chase. Watching to see if you'll break. Watching to see if you'll lose your composure and reach out first. In that quiet space, she's measuring your strength, even if she doesn't admit it to herself. That's why your response to silence matters more than words ever could. When you don't react emotionally, when you don't rush to fill the quiet, when you stay grounded and focused, the silence starts working against her instead of for her. Because the moment you stop trying to control the narrative, her mind starts filling in the gaps. Silence is not the end of the story. It's the pause where emotions grow louder. And the strongest move you can make is to let the silence speak while you keep moving forward. If you were truly irrelevant to her, there would be no silence at all. People don't go quiet for things that no longer matter. They don't hesitate, hold back, or restrain themselves over someone who has no emotional value. When something loses importance, it fades naturally. There is no effort involved, no tension, no pause. Silence only exists when something still has influence. Indifference is loud in its own way. It shows up as ease, as freedom, as someone living their life without second thoughts. When a person has genuinely moved on, they don't need to protect their emotions, because there's nothing left to protect. They speak casually, they interact without weight, they don't calculate their words or avoid situations that might trigger memories. Silence, however, is heavy. It carries intention. It carries restraint. Her silence suggests that she's holding something back, and people only hold back when there's something inside them they're afraid of revealing. If you didn't matter, there would be no reason to stop herself from speaking. She wouldn't care how her words landed. She wouldn't care if she reached out or didn't. The absence of communication would be effortless. But silence requires awareness. It requires choice. Ask yourself this: why would someone choose not to speak if speaking had no consequence? They wouldn't. Silence is chosen when communication feels dangerous. Dangerous because it might expose feelings she hasn't resolved, or because it might reopen a door she's trying to keep closed while still standing near it. There's also a psychological tension in silence that people underestimate. Silence creates space for imagination. It creates unanswered questions. And when someone is irrelevant, they don't occupy that mental space. They don't appear in quiet moments. They don't surface in memories when the day slows down. Silence means you still appear when nothing else is making noise. Sometimes silence is an attempt to erase influence. She might believe that by not speaking, she can slowly remove you from her life. But what often happens is the opposite. The quiet amplifies the thoughts she's trying to suppress. The mind fills silence with what it's trying hardest to avoid, and that's how you remain present without saying a word. Silence is also a form of emotional negotiation. She's trying to figure out where she stands with you without directly asking. She's gauging whether you still care, whether you'll react, whether you'll reach out. And that only matters when someone still holds emotional relevance. You don't negotiate with the past if it no longer affects you. There's a difference between cutting someone off and growing past them. Growth doesn't need silence, it creates distance naturally. Silence is forced distance. It's artificial space created to manage feelings that haven't settled yet. That forced space tells you that the connection isn't dead, it's restrained. If she truly felt nothing, she wouldn't need silence as a barrier. She wouldn't fear conversation. She wouldn't worry about reopening anything. Silence exists because something is still unfinished, something still unresolved, something still emotionally active beneath the surface. And the most important part is this: when you understand that silence is not proof of your insignificance, you stop chasing validation. You stop reacting emotionally. You let her silence echo back at her. And in that echo, she feels the weight of your absence more than she ever felt your presence. Silence only surrounds what still matters. Inside her silence, there is a war happening that no one else can see. It's not calm and it's not clarity. It's conflict. Her heart wants one thing, and her ego demands another. And when those two collide, silence becomes the battlefield. She doesn't stop speaking because she has nothing to say. She stops because saying anything would reveal which side is winning. Her heart remembers the connection, the comfort, the moments that felt real. It remembers how you made her feel, not just the good times, but the emotional safety, the familiarity, the sense of being understood. The heart doesn't operate on logic. It doesn't care about pride or outcomes. It just knows what it felt. And those feelings don't disappear just because a situation changed. But the ego steps in with fear and self-protection. The ego reminds her of pride, of control, of the risk of rejection. It tells her that reaching out might make her look weak, or desperate, or vulnerable. It tells her that silence keeps her safe, keeps her in control, keeps her from being hurt again. And so the ego builds walls while the heart keeps knocking from the inside. That tension is exhausting, and silence is the only place where both sides can exist without losing. By staying quiet, she doesn't have to admit she still cares, and she doesn't have to pretend she doesn't. Silence allows her to delay a decision. It pauses the moment where she would have to choose between honesty and protection. This is why silence feels heavy. It's not empty space, it's pressure. Pressure from thoughts she avoids during the day, but can't escape at night. Pressure from memories that surface when she's alone. Pressure from questions like, should I reach out? And what if he's changed? And what if I'm too late? Her mind circles these thoughts while her ego holds her still. The ego fears losing power. It believes that whoever speaks first loses leverage. Whoever breaks silence gives up control. So even when her heart leans toward you, her ego tightens its grip. It convinces her that staying quiet is strength, even when it feels like emotional paralysis. But here's the truth: real strength doesn't need silence to survive. Silence is often the ego's last defense. It's the shield used when emotions are too strong to confront directly. If she were truly done, there would be no internal debate, no hesitation, no emotional tension. The decision would be clean and quiet, not heavy and restrained. Her silence also reflects fear of change. Reaching out could shift everything. It could reopen conversations she's not ready to have. It could expose her to outcomes she can't control. Silence keeps everything frozen in place, even if that place is uncomfortable, because the known discomfort feels safer than the unknown truth. And while she stays silent, the battle continues. The heart grows louder the longer it's ignored. The ego grows more rigid the more it resists. Silence stretches, but it can't resolve the conflict, it only delays it. This is where your role becomes critical. When you don't chase, when you don't try to force clarity, when you don't react emotionally, you stop feeding her ego. You remove the power struggle. And without that struggle, her ego weakens, because it no longer has something to defend against. Silence collapses when there's nothing to fight. And when you stay grounded, focused, and unbothered, her internal war becomes impossible to ignore. Let her silence reveal the truth she's not ready to face. Real emotional bonds don't disappear quietly. They don't fade without resistance, and they don't dissolve in silence. When something truly mattered, it leaves an imprint, it creates echoes, and those echoes don't vanish just because communication stops. Silence, in this case, is not closure, it's evidence that closure never happened. When a connection is shallow, it ends cleanly. There's distance without tension. There's separation without reflection. But when the bond was real, when emotions were invested, the ending is rarely smooth. There are unanswered questions, unresolved feelings, and moments that replay long after everything is supposed to be over. Silence becomes the space where all of that lives. People often confuse silence with moving on, but moving on has a certain finality to it. It brings a sense of emotional resolution. Silence, on the other hand, feels unfinished. It feels like a door that's closed but not locked. There's hesitation in that closure, a sense that something important was left behind without explanation. Unfinished emotional bonds create mental noise. Even in quiet moments, the mind returns to what wasn't said, what wasn't resolved. Conversations replay with different endings. Scenarios are rewritten internally. Silence doesn't erase the bond, it gives it room to grow in the background. That's why silence can feel heavier than conflict. Arguments create release, they bring emotion to the surface. Silence traps emotion inside. It forces feelings inward, where they become thoughts, and those thoughts turn into attachment that lingers longer than it should. If the bond had truly ended, silence wouldn't be necessary. There would be no emotional residue, no pull, no reflection. She wouldn't avoid you, she would simply exist without you. Avoidance is an action. Silence is an action, and actions always come from emotional motivation. Silence also preserves the bond in a suspended state. By not addressing what happened, by not closing the chapter properly, the connection remains emotionally alive. It's neither together nor fully apart, and that limbo keeps you present in her internal world. The mind struggles with unresolved endings. It seeks completion. It looks for meaning. When it doesn't get that, it holds onto the memory longer, trying to make sense of it. Silence feeds that process. It keeps the bond active, even when nothing is being said. This is why time alone doesn't always heal. Time only works when there is resolution. Without it, silence can actually strengthen attachment. It turns memories into questions and questions into emotional loops. And those loops quietly pull her attention back to you again and again. Silence doesn't mean the bond is weak. It often means it was strong enough to survive without words. It means it left a mark deep enough that it couldn't be erased through distance alone. And when you understand this, you stop seeing silence as rejection. You stop internalizing it as failure. You recognize it for what it is, a sign that the emotional story is incomplete. The most powerful thing you can do in this moment is not to force an ending, not to demand answers, not to reopen wounds just to satisfy your curiosity. Because forced closure rarely heals. It only creates new damage. Instead, you allow the silence to expose what it's trying to hide. You let the unresolved bond do what unresolved bonds always do, resurface when the mind can no longer ignore it. What is unfinished always finds a way to speak. Your absence carries a weight that words never could. When you stop explaining, stop chasing, and stop trying to prove your value, something shifts. The noise disappears, and in that quiet, your absence begins to speak, not through messages or calls, but through the sudden realization that access to you is no longer guaranteed. When you were present, available, and responsive, your value may have felt familiar, almost invisible. Familiarity has a way of dulling impact, but absence sharpens it. It forces reflection. It creates contrast between what was there and what is now missing, and that contrast is powerful. When you pull back with dignity, not bitterness, you remove the emotional safety net she unconsciously relied on. She no longer knows where she stands with you. She no longer knows if you're still thinking about her or if you've moved forward without her. And uncertainty has a way of magnifying emotions. Your absence disrupts patterns. She was used to a version of you that responded, explained, reassured. When that version disappears, the mind searches for reasons. It asks questions it avoided before. Why is he quiet? Why didn't he react? Why didn't he chase? And in those questions, you become present again without saying a word. Silence matched with strength creates imbalance. Not the unhealthy kind, but the kind that forces self-reflection. When you don't rush to fill the silence, she's left alone with her thoughts. And those thoughts often lead back to you, not because you demanded attention, but because you stopped offering it freely. Absence also reveals attachment. When something is always available, it feels endless. When it's removed, the reality of loss becomes real. She begins to feel what your presence once provided, emotionally, mentally, even energetically. And once that space is felt, it can't be unfelt. This isn't about punishment or manipulation. It's about self-respect. Absence becomes powerful when it's a byproduct of growth, not a tactic. When you step back to focus on your purpose, your discipline, your direction, your energy shifts, and people feel that shift even from a distance. Your absence tells a story without explanation. It says you chose yourself. It says you didn't collapse when things went quiet. It says you didn't beg for validation. And that message is far louder than any emotional argument could ever be. When she realizes that you didn't stay stuck, that you didn't linger in the same emotional place, it challenges her perception. It forces her to confront the idea that she may have underestimated your strength. And that realization lingers. Absence removes the illusion of control. When you're always present, predictable, reachable, control feels easy. When you're gone, control disappears. And without control, the ego becomes restless. That restlessness often turns into curiosity, reflection, and sometimes regret. The key is consistency. Absence only works when it's real. When you don't disappear to get a reaction, but because you've genuinely shifted your focus. That authenticity is what gives absence its weight. And in that quiet space where you no longer reach out, explain, or chase, your absence becomes the message she can't stop hearing. A man who understands silence doesn't fear it, and he never rushes to destroy it. He knows that noise is easy, but restraint takes strength. Begging for attention, clarity, or reassurance only reveals dependence. Silence, when understood, becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is self-respect. When you chase someone who has gone quiet, you hand over your power. You show that your emotional balance depends on their response. And the moment someone senses that, the dynamic shifts, respect weakens. Attraction fades, not because you cared, but because you abandoned your center in the process. The man who understands silence knows that reacting emotionally only feeds uncertainty. He knows that explaining doesn't create understanding, it creates pressure. Silence invites the other person to confront their own emotions instead of distracting them with your words. Begging for noise is not communication, it's fear speaking. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear of not being enough. And fear has a frequency people feel instantly. It repels rather than draws closer. Silence paired with calm confidence does the opposite. When you stay grounded, when you continue building your life, your body, your purpose, you send a message without sending a message. You show that your value doesn't rise or fall based on someone else's attention. That kind of energy doesn't demand, it attracts. Understanding silence also means understanding timing. Some truths only surface when there's space for them to breathe. If you rush conversation, you suffocate clarity. Silence allows emotions to settle, thoughts to mature, and intentions to reveal themselves naturally. The man who doesn't beg understands that if something is meant to return, it will do so freely, not under pressure. And if it doesn't return, he doesn't lose himself trying to resurrect it. He keeps moving forward, not as an act of pride, but as an act of alignment. Silence filters intentions. It reveals who reaches out from clarity and who only reacts from loneliness. When you don't interrupt that process, you gain insight instead of confusion. You see people for who they are, not who you hoped they'd be. This level of restraint requires discipline. It means sitting with discomfort without trying to escape it. It means resisting the urge to fill the quiet just to feel momentary relief. But that discipline builds inner strength, and inner strength is impossible to ignore. When she sees that you didn't collapse, didn't chase, didn't lose direction, something shifts. Silence stops being her shield and starts becoming her question. And questions grow louder the longer they remain unanswered. You don't win by being louder. You win by being unshakable. Silence doesn't break the man who understands it, it reveals him.